Phyrexia All Will Be One will probably go down as one of the greatest sets in Magic's history, just thinking about lore and how it uses that to call back to some of the most powerful cards in Magic's history. There's a lot for everyone to explore. And I want to use one of the more recent spoilers from this set to have a discussion about Magic's power and how there might be a boogeyman lying in wait in the modern format. Now, this discussion really starts with our Eternal formats. And for those of you that are coming into Magic a little bit newer, you may be coming in through Commander or something like an Arena format. And as our aforementioned Commander format it is an Eternal format. But we have constructed ones as well, like Pauper, Legacy, and Vintage. Now, the conversation really starts with Legacy and Vintage being 60-card constructed formats where you're able to play with cards from all over Magic's history, from some of the original sets, whereas Legacy has a very robust ban list, and Vintage has very nuanced restricted list. Playing with singletons across Magic's history, you're able to play with cards such as Black Lotus and the Power 9. But of course, even in those formats, we have some of the most powerful cards out there that still need to be banned. And that's where the discussion starts with what I would think is a very unassuming card from an age-old set called New Phyrexia. And I'm talking about Mental Misstep. Now, Mental Misstep comes in at 1 mana, being able to counter a spell of 1 CMC with 1 blue Phyrexian mana. Firstly, we should look at a banned and restricted announcement on September 20th of 2011, where Mental Misstep is first banned in Legacy. And really the thing to look at are twofold, and that's going to be the aspect of its mana cost and its aspect of accessibility to all decks in the Legacy format. Mental Misstep uses 1 blue Phyrexian mana that allows you to play either a blue mana or 2 life to cast the spell. Because of the life cost, you're not restricted to the deck that you're playing it. You could play it in a mono green deck because you'll never need blue mana for it. You could always use it with 2 life. And then in terms of low cost, being 1 mana is extremely versatile. In a format like Legacy with hyper aggressive, really efficient draw spells like Brainstorm, Preordain, whatever it might be, there are a lot of low CMC spells in the format for something like Mental Misstep to target. And again, that's where the problem lied, because decks essentially became what everyone referred to as 56 cards, because it only became natural to run Mental Misstep. Because you would go to cast your first 1 CMC spell, your opponent would Mental Misstep it, then you would Mental Misstep it, then they would Mental Misstep, and it would go back and forth, and the really game would be decided by whoever had more Mental Missteps. And you can tell how this becomes very problematic. If even non-blue decks are able to do this, you're not even able to play a non-blue deck to play around the 1 CMC stuff, play higher CMC stuff. It's only better for you to play Mental Misstep. And now even in Vintage, where you're able to play with Black Lotus and the Power 9, we see a restriction in Mental Misstep. We see that in 2009, along with Karn the Great Creator and other cards, we see a restriction of Mental Misstep, one of the most powerful cards ever printed in Magic's history. Being able to interact with some of the most efficient spells and really speak to and call to the power of both of these formats. And that's going to lead to the discussion around Minor Misstep, a spiritual reprint, a little brother to what Mental Misstep once was. Now, Minor Misstep being very different in the sense that it does not cost a Phyrexian mana, but instead costs a blue mana. So there aren't 2 ways, or isn't 2 ways to cast the spell, there's only 1. And so it's not going along the same 2 axes of accessibility and mana cost, because it's not free and it's not being able to be played, for example, by mono white or mono green decks. You'll have to be in a blue deck or have access to blue mana to cast a spell like this. So it's a lot less problematic. And what I'll tell you from the offset is a spell like this has a very low cost to playing it and only becomes more powerful as your format becomes more powerful, because those are the type of formats that are going to be more efficient in the type of spells that they're playing. Even, for example, in formats like Modern, we see plenty of spells like Ragavan or Dragon's Rage Channeler that are on the lower side of their CMC that can be taken advantage of with a card like Minor Misstep. And I think that's where the discussion really drove home for a lot of folks. Where Mental Misstep was a scourge of Legacy and Vintage, is printing a card like Minor Misstep an actual mistake for formats like Modern, Legacy, and heck, even Vintage? Is this going to be the new scourge? And I think what I'll do is keep it simple. I don't think so. Honestly, without being able to be accessible throughout every archetype out there, decks aren't going to be quote unquote 56 card decks. There still is a cost to it. And for many of you more esteemed Magic players out there, the difference between 0 and 1 mana is astronomical. The difference between 1 and 2 is obviously 2 mana is double that of 1. And it's almost to say that 0 mana versus 1 mana is an even greater gap than double, because you don't require any onboard resources to cast a spell like that. In terms of Phyrexian mana, your life becomes a resource. Now, Minor Misstep kind of led me to think about what I think is one of probably the most problematic cards that has been lying in wait in the modern format. The discussion came around with its CMC and accessibility. And that's kind of the theme of this video. With spells becoming more efficient in Magic in general, and specifically in the modern format, we see a general reduction in the CMC of the format, and even higher cost spells requiring less mana based on how many cards you delve away. And spells like that lean towards cards like Minor Misstep, because then the card like that becomes more powerful. So what are the analogs to a card like this? If Minor Misstep isn't going to be playable in the modern format, and Mental Misstep, for those of you wondering, is already banned in the modern format, what am I talking about? Well, let's take a look at a deck list like Modern Izzet Murktide, and a card that has been around almost since the fruition of the archetype in the modern format. It's Spell Pierce. And I think that's where my discussion and my thought process, and really what I want to pitch to you, is Spell Pierce one of the most problematic cards in the modern format? Now, hear me out here. Let's have a bit of a discussion about this before you let me know what you think. Spell Pierce has been seeing an increase in play, as with the increase of more powerful sets, with the Modern Horizon sets introducing spells like Force of Negation and Counterspell. It's only more paramount that you are as efficient as possible with your non-creature spells. With there being an answer to almost everything, especially with our now answers being threats in the elementals, your spells need to do as much as possible or be as efficient as possible for their cost. It's a card that really helps traditionally against spell-heavy decks, control decks, combo decks, whatever it might be. But in Modern, it seems like so many of the archetypes that are able to play a card like this are blue, which has traditionally been growing in the Modern format. The amount of blue decks out there being able to play Counterspell, Teferi, historically Yorion, and some of the Force of Negation and further problematic spells out there. It's very easy to actually splash blue in a fetch land format. In a format where your mana base is very easy to cultivate into, you may not have dual lands, but you have shock lands that do a very good representation of those, and I'm pretty sure Death Shadow players will be very happy about that. But even the Shadow players, being Grixis in many ways, will still splash for not only Drown in the Loch, but Spell Pierce. Now, if we look at the number of non-creature spells in the modern format, I think you'll start to see why Spell Pierce is essentially a main deck staple in not just Izzet Murktide, but many of the blue decks in the format. There are decks like Burn and Azorius Control that Spell Pierce would take very much a good advantage of, stopping the majority of their spells, including their planeswalkers, artifacts, whatever it might be, all the way down to Lightning Bolt. Spell Pierce is able to take advantage of them. But where it becomes really nice with a card like Spell Pierce is even against creature-based tempo, combo, aggro decks, so however you want to think about them, such as Hammer. We see that some of the most key spells in that deck, such as Colossus Hammer or Sigarda's Aid, are non-creature spells. If we delve even further into a deck like Amulet Titan, we see key spells like Amulet of Vigor or Summoner's Pact also are non-creature spells. What I'm trying to get at is Spell Pierce has essentially become a main board staple. Long gone are the days where Spell Pierce comes in against the control matchup and it's no longer useful against the creature matchup, because the creature decks of old are in the past. We are not in the days of a modern format where humans is the ruler of the roost, much to the happiness of many Death Shadow players out there and mid-range players alike. But regardless, the efficiency that the Modern Horizon sets have brought to the modern format has brought a card like Spell Pierce to the forefront. Now, whether or not the card is broken is up to the user, the viewer, the opponent themselves playing against it. But what I think is that there will come a day when a card like Spell Pierce actually becomes problematic. When a card like Spell Pierce might slowly start approaching the mental misstep problem. And that's what I really wanted to highlight today. I wanted to get the juices flowing. I wanted to get your opinion about it. What do you think? With the mental misstep historically being one of those age-old historical powerful cards, and minor misstep doing a great callback to it, but unfortunately just not having that same level of accessibility in it, do you think that Spell Pierce being that quote-unquote catch-all to a hyper-efficient format, will it be the next boogeyman in Modern? Let me know in the comment section down below. I may just be ranting, but I'd love to know what you think.